just this past weekend gone, we saw the completion of the 2020 CrossFit Games, and once again we saw a very, very dominant performance from two of the greatest athletes in CrossFit history, Matt Fraser and Tia Toomey. Now, we got to take a little look at some of their max strength capabilities, and we're going to take a little journey into how strong do you need to be to win the CrossFit Games. So we're going to take a look more closely at Tia and Matt. So these are the two we're going to pick in particular because these are the most dominant CrossFit athletes, as we mentioned. Now, obviously, there is other outliers, and Matt didn't deadlift the most. And we saw someone, for example, in the earlier rounds of the games, front squat 220 kilos. So Tia back squatted 152 kilos.
330.
Matt back squatted 223 kilos approximately. So they did it in pounds, which is annoying that they don't speak in kilos, but sure, what can you do? So I think the squat is probably, of the strength exercises, probably the most telling and the most relevant for what they need to win in CrossFit. So if you look at both of them, they absolutely dominated the squat. Matt's 223 was maybe inside 90% of what his max looked like. So that morning they had some kind of a run and a hill sprint, so they obviously are quite fatigued from that. But obviously, as they're CrossFit athletes, they're used to this kind of level of volume and this kind of training multiple times a day and doing different kind of modalities in their training across the same day. Now, I would reckon fresh, Matt would probably squat somewhere in the region of 235, maybe 240, which is the numbers me and Fitz were kind of discussing what we would expect for someone to have in the CrossFit Games. And so Tia, she did 152, but to be honest, I think fresh she looks like she could do north of 160, probably up to 170, maybe on a good day if she did a little bit of kind of a taper for a few weeks or a little bit of specific strength training if she really needed to. Obviously they don't need to, but I think the squat is probably the most relevant for CrossFit in terms of kind of its carryover to obviously weightlifting in particular. So any weightlifting event, the higher your back squat is, and they have both of them, interestingly, have a very quad dominant back squat, and I think this is kind of important for a couple of reasons. So obviously this will transfer to most of the weightlifting events, and we obviously saw when we went to the Snatch triple event, they had a Snatch speed ladder. They obviously dominated the this event. Both of them won this event, and so in CrossFit, you'd probably want to be snatching somewhere for the males, somewhere in the region of 135 or 140 fairly comfortably. And then any more than that is probably useless because the snatch events never go beyond 125 or 130 from what we've seen. And then on the women's side, you're probably looking at somewhere north of 95 or maybe closer to 100 kilos if possible. But again, it's not really worth going beyond that. But we saw both of these. So if you took these numbers and then if you had to pick a back squat that was relevant or kind of approximate a back squat that you would need to hit these numbers kind of comfortably, somewhere around 170 for the women would be very, very relevant. And then for the men is something like we were thinking 240, 250, depending on your kind of strength abilities. Maybe a little bit lower, depending on how efficient you are. But somewhere around that kind of 240 back squat, 170 makes sense for those weightlifting numbers. So that would kind of put you down in the weightlifting event. And then if you look at other events that they compete regularly in CrossFit, so any kind of bike event, weighted sprints, we see an awful lot, sled pushes, hill running, all very quad dominant exercises. And we saw from both of their squats that they were very quad dominant. So they kind of had these on a lockdown very well and would transfer the most to these events.
Okay, yeah, so talking about the back squats, I'm just going to mention a few things. I don't think these are kind of max out attempts by any means. I'd say they're probably around 85 to 90% of 1RM or of true 1RM. I think in particular when you look at the events that came before the back squat, so you had the first workout, which was a 1500 meter row, followed by muscle ups and some shoulder to overhead. These are obviously going to be fatiguing. It's also on the first day of the game, so it's not going to be an all-out effort. I think that will definitely go into it later on with the deadlift. But when we look at these squats, all the jumps were very conservative. We didn't have any, I don't think on the male side anyway, we had any misses. I don't think we did on the female side. All athletes were making controlled jumps the whole time. We didn't see any big leaps or kind of starting low and then making bigger jumps as they go forward, or kind of making their second attempt that they know will be easy and then really going for on the third. So I think there are aspects to looking at these strength lifts that might show us kind of that there's more in the tank. Definitely on the squats anyway. The other interesting thing when you look at the squats is that we have Matt Fraser and Tia, who are the clear winners. Like you have like big gaps. They're really, really dominant in the squats. But then I think we have clear losers on the other end of the scale. And I think when you look at kind of Noah Olsen, when you look at Quant, they're down around 200 kilo squats. It might be 206 and 208, something like that. They're much, much lower. Like opening up those 10 kilo gaps at the start is obviously bad for them in the overall event. But I think on an overall, if you just look at them as a CrossFitter, they could definitely get some gain by getting that kind of high bar back squat or any back squat much, much higher. It'll probably just make them more proficient as an athlete moving forward. Then the last piece, I think, on the squats, and it's a quite interesting one when you look at as an overall, like the squats effect on a CrossFitter's ability to be really good at CrossFit. It's very interesting. Like Gerf talked about the quad dominant squat, so like a high bar weightlifter style squat. It definitely, like, so Matt and Tia both had that kind of weightlifter style squat. They're both weightlifters before they were CrossFitters, or like they're both very, very proficient weightlifters. Like Tia has a Commonwealth Games gold medal, I think. Matt was on Team USA or close enough to being on Team USA. Like they're very, very proficient weightlifters, and the way weightlifters squat is very quad dominant. So I think moving forward, like if you were to kind of pattern what the really successful CrossFitter looks like, and you'd have to take both of these people obviously as being really successful CrossFitters. It might be interesting just to look at, like, okay, should they really be looking at a very quad dominant high bar back squat?
So moving on to the results of the press event, I think these are probably the least relevant and probably, again, not as relevant to kind of what it means for any other lifts from the from compared to the squat. So Matt pressed 95 kilos and Tia pressed 63 kilos. So it's kind of hard to tell if they had more realistically in them, if they trained a bit or kind of tapered for this or were fresher. I suppose they had other events that morning. So Tia's looked like she had a little bit more, and I think hers are kind of in line with what we would have expected. I would have thought the men would have had a little bit of a higher press, but again, what would they get out of it for their CrossFit bar max strict press events like this one? But in relation to any other events they'd be doing, I don't think there's a whole lot of benefit from them having an extra 10, 15 kilos compared to the kind of the effort it might take to put in to get that bigger press. Other than that, I think this is right in line where maybe the minimum would need to be for both of them, around 60 kilos for women and at least 90 or more for men, especially in terms of just a little bit over 8 stability for weightlifting events or kind of handstand push-ups. The reason I would have thought they might have had a little bit bigger of a press, Matt in particular, now it may have been that there was probably an outlier somewhere in the top 40 CrossFitters. So if we saw of games where there was a full number of athletes, we almost certainly would have seen an outlier there who's just freakishly good at pressing, would have pressed somewhere north of 105 or 110 probably. But given the amount of upper body work CrossFitters do, especially the elite level CrossFitters, and the implications, you would expect it a little bit more of a press. But again, I don't think it would benefit any of them, for example Matt or Tia, to increase their press massively and spend time on it. Again, there's not a whole lot to say about this press other than that it is what it is.
Yeah, on the press, I'd have to agree with Gerf there. Like I don't think strict press 1 rep max has a huge carryover to CrossFit or even to your ability to be a very good CrossFitter. What I would say is, right, all the lads, Gerf thought you might see heavier strict presses. Like, to be honest, I probably wouldn't agree with that. Like, I think for the vast majority of fairly elite adult males, a 90 kilo plus strict press is very, very legit. Like, I think, and you can see from the spread across the group, like I think 4 of them lie between 93 and 95 or 96 kilos. So I think that does seem to be the kind of the top end of kind of elite males. Obviously, we have one that's around 79 or 80 kilos. I think for the females, the spread is a lot larger. And I think that's one of the interesting things about like the side of CrossFit, like the female side of CrossFit, is that you do see more of a spread. You do see kind of more specialists of like girls who are really, really fit, very good at body weight work, very good at gymnastics work. And then you have the other end of the scale of girls who are incredibly strong, really high work capacity in the short workouts, and like not so good on the long workouts or not so good on the body weight workouts. So I think it's an interesting kind of microcosm of the female CrossFit realm on a whole. Like I think with the male side of things, you are seeing a kind of homogenizing of it, a bringing together of the kind of all-rounder, and we're seeing less of the big, huge hulks who are incredibly strong, and we're seeing the end of the kind of Chris Spieler generation where you have these guys who are absolute whippets, are very, very good at their aerobic capacity workouts, very good at longer workouts and bodyweight workouts, but not necessarily that strong. So I think it is quite interesting to see the kind of homogenous nature of the male side of CrossFit, or the kind of growing trend of guys becoming all-rounders, and the kind of outliers that Garth spoke about becoming more rare. But we still kind of see it in the female side of things, that even across these 5 athletes, we see a fairly big range in their strict press.
So moving on to the deadlift event, I think this is probably not as relevant as a squat, but it definitely has uses to have a larger max deadlift. So we saw Tia deadlift at 188 kilos.
9 by 4 pounds, but if she can get anything over what she just did.
And then we saw Matt deadlift at 243 kilos.
535 on the bar for Fraser.
Wow.
Now, Matt didn't win the deadlift, and he actually didn't win the whole event, but someone deadlifted, I think it was Adler, deadlifted 253 or something, slightly more, maybe 10, 15 kilos more than Matt did. So again, like we've mentioned in the last few events, that it might have been that they're quite fatigued, but this is approximately around where we would imagine you would need the kind of a minimum effective deadlift you would need for CrossFit events in terms of a 1RM. So somewhere around 250 plus or minus 10, 15 kilos, again, depending on their anatomy and how well they like deadlifting, the proficiency at deadlifting. But one of the reasons you need approximately 250 is, say, for example, on like repeatability events where you're doing rep deadlifts, or you're doing something like high rep hang cleans or high rep kind of snatches, stuff like that. Well, we don't have a strong correlation between a 1RM deadlift and a 1RM snatch or clean and jerk like we would with the squat. You would imagine though that a higher deadlift would allow for better repetition at lower weights, so it would just technically feel lighter and it'd be a lower percentage of your absolute 1RM. So this would allow for a bit more of because the speed is lower on these like touch and go events like our snatches for 10s or clean or hang cleans and stuff like that for 10s. It's not so much a high velocity event anymore, but more of a kind of a good mix between force and velocity. So a higher deadlift in that regard would allow for potentially better repeatability. So somewhere around 250 would be more than enough. Any more than that, then it would kind of depend on the person's proficiency with deadlifting, if they're able to do more, or if they just enjoy deadlifting. But any more than that, it wouldn't really pay to kind of distribute that extra resources to a bigger 1RM deadlift.
I think the application of heavy deadlifts in CrossFit, like it's kind of hit and miss. I think definitely somebody having a prerequisite of a very, very heavy deadlift is obviously going to help them with their barbell cycling. It's going to help them maintain good positions when they're under fatigue. So if they're doing hang cleans for sets of 10, or like as Garth was saying, these kind of higher rep sets, it's going to allow them to maintain better positions. So I think then when you see better CrossFitters, they'll probably have better 1RM deadlifts. Obviously there'll be outliers to that. The other thing I think with the deadlift, and it's particularly applicable in this event, is that the deadlifts are so fatiguing. So in terms of your CNS, in terms of your musculature in general, you're going to get very, very broken up from doing deadlifts. And I think what you could have been seeing here, like obviously Adler went out and got the max deadlift. He won the event because of that.
I mean, I tell you, I was not really expecting him to have.
But what I think you're seeing is like people holding themselves back slightly. Maybe like I know Brooke Wells went for an absolutely all-out deadlift as well, and got like a supremely heavy deadlift. But I think in terms of like intelligent games play, maxing out on your deadlift probably isn't the best thing to do here, unless you're really, really pushing hard for an event win.
So I think if we kind of extrapolate those results out we got, and we take a look at another event they did, which was the Snatch speed ladder. So they did 3 rounds of 3 snatches as fast as they could, so different weights. The men's ended up on 130, and the women's ended up on 85 kilos. So Matt and Tia both won these events again, and won them quite well. So Matt actually missed his last snatch, but it was just, and then he went again for like 5-6 seconds later, made it no problem. So that's just a good example of the transfer of that strength. But then if you look across at all the other events, Matt and Tia were obviously running through all of these events, and this is like, I think it's their 5th games in a row, and I think it might be Tia's 4th, I'm not too sure. Again, like absolute strength. So having one of the biggest squats there, along with enough for the deadlift, and then the press again is not really that relevant, I suppose, unless we'll see as the years go by. But again, so big quad dominant squat. Their weightlifting is very, very good. They obviously put a lot of effort into their weightlifting, but they get a lot of benefit from their squat like that. And then they both have, obviously T's deadlift is quite high, and Matt's deadlift was high enough to do what they needed to do for the other events. So any more kind of thought or resources put into increasing these numbers probably wouldn't be of any benefit. We said if they had a little taper week, or they took a few 2 or 3 weeks to do a little bit more focus on this. So one of these issues though would be if they put more resources into increasing their 1RM strength, they would likely see a decreased performance in their kind of aerobic areas that are high rep areas. And so that comes from kind of a lot of the evidence in the last few years from kind of research coming out in terms of like fiber kind of type of like type 2 and type 2X and type 1, is that after even a single workout of high rep events, we can see like a transfer from type 2X to type 1 fibers, so from fast twitch to slow twitch fibers. And so for CrossFit, you're much more in need of slow twitch fibers in terms of the events. Like far more of the events require that kind of high rep aerobic capacity compared to that like 1 rep explosive event. And obviously having just that minimum number of squat to do those numbers that you need to do no more, and then allocate your resources in other areas, is probably the most relevant here. So if you are an aspiring elite CrossFitter, get strong enough and then practice your weightlifting in all your events. So like we're always talking about, be really smart with your events. Obviously maybe there is a future elite CrossFit watching this and he's like, I'm going to get my squat to 240.
Okay, so hopefully the future of the 2024 CrossFit Games is watching this, and you've gotten some of that kind of data away of how strong you probably need to be at the moment to win the games, or how strong the games winners are at the moment. Like the snatch is another thing that I think people do put a lot of thought into, and people put a lot of thought behind the number, and they get caught up in the number a lot of the time. But it does seem to be a lot of the CrossFit events for the last few years, 120, 130 kilos seems to be around that point of the heaviest the ladders get. And like in this event, 130 was the heaviest the speed ladder got in the finals. I think Matt's is 140 at the moment. I'm not sure what Tia's max snatch ever is, but like you see in the female event, those numbers are going up to 84 kilos. So like they're relatively high numbers. I think for the females, they're probably higher than the males, but they're all like very, very doable, very reachable numbers. In conclusion on this, I think there are some things to be looked at. I think there are some things to be gleaned from this. Like I think a very vertical quad dominant high bar back squat in a weightlifter style seems to be the best form of back squatting at the moment for the kind of different events that are popping up in CrossFit. I think looking at these numbers, if you're a competitive athlete at the moment and you're saying, how am I going to plan my next 6-8 months, a year of training? I think looking at these numbers, if you're somebody who's competitive, or else looking at a drop down from these numbers and saying, okay, I'm reaching whatever level it is in my competitions at the moment. I want to get to the next level, so maybe I can snatch 100 kilos at the moment. Maybe you need to snatch 110. Maybe you need to clean and jerk 140. And maybe your back squat needs to be 200 kilos plus. Or you could be in the situation whereby you have loads of strength. You have a 220 back squat already. You have a 260 deadlift already. And now it's time for you to kind of pull back from those areas. Just keep maintaining them. But really pull back some of your kind of training capital or recovery capital and put that into your aerobic conditioning or your gymnastics or some other event, whether that be swimming or running. So I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you could give it a like, or if you could subscribe. If you want to see some training programs that we use with our athletes, so we do specific strength training for CrossFitters, that's on our website. We also do our one-off programs like the Seek a Strength Road to Anywhere back squat. We do the Seek a Strength Express press program. These are all one-off programs. So the squat program and the press program run for 8 weeks. They're 2 days a week. There's accessory work included, and they're programmed and designed to be run concurrently with your other sessions. And then we have the Seek a Pull program. That's our most recent of the one-off programs. So it's 10 weeks to get a better one rep max deadlift. Thanks.